September 28, 2022. What began as a routine warning during hurricane season turned, in just a few days, into one of the most destructive disasters in Florida's history. Hurricane Ian arrived not only with wind, its deadliest force was water. Storm surge from the coast and freshwater flooding inland. Thousands of homes were damaged, hundreds of thousands of people lost power, and entire coastal communities were temporarily cut off. This is a precise timeline of what happened from the first advisories to consequences measured not in days but in months. On September 23, 2022, at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, the U.S. National Hurricane Center began regular advisories for Tropical Depression 9. The system formed in the southwestern Caribbean, south of Jamaica. At this stage, it did not yet look like a major catastrophe, but the meteorological setup was already concerning. Very warm water, high humidity, and weak wind shear, ideal conditions for rapid strengthening. Early forecast scenarios indicated that, if the track held, the storm could cross Cuba and enter the Gulf of Mexico toward western Florida. At 5 a.m. on September 24th, the depression strengthened into Tropical Storm Ian. From that point forward, emergency communication expanded and daily preparedness messaging intensified across Florida. It was still too early to name an exact impact point. The forecast corridor now included densely populated coastal zones. For local authorities, that meant shifting from monitoring to action, checking evacuation routes, preparing shelters, and coordinating with power and emergency services. At 5 a.m. on September 26th, Ian reached hurricane strength as a Category 1 storm. It passed west of the Cayman Islands and continued organizing. Each advisory showed the same trend: a larger and more structurally stable cyclone. Florida counties began phased evacuation decisions for the most vulnerable areas, especially barrier islands and low-lying coastal zones. Officials repeatedly emphasized storm surge risk, often the leading cause of death in hurricanes, even when people survived the wind. At 4:30 a.m. on September 27th, Ian made landfall in western Cuba, in Pinar del Rio province, as a Category 3 hurricane. The storm brought destructive wind and intense rainfall, damaging power infrastructure and communication lines. By daytime, electrical outages had become widespread. After crossing the island, Ian emerged into the Gulf of Mexico. This is where the most dangerous phase began. Over exponentially warm water, Ian intensified further and approached Florida as a storm of a different scale. During the night of September 28th, roughly between 2 and 8 a.m., Ian reached maximum intensity. Post-storm analysis indicates this window met Category 5 parameters. Sustained winds approached 160 miles per hour, about 257 kilometers per hour. Morning NHC advisories for Southwest Florida used the strongest language. Storm surge could be catastrophic. That meant coastal areas could be inundated very quickly, and flood depth could become life-threatening before evacuation by personal vehicle was still possible. From 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. on September 28th, the final evacuation phase was underway. Lee, Charlotte, and Collier counties issued mandatory orders for coastal and low-lying zones. Highways became congested, fuel demand surged, and temporary shelters filled rapidly. Authorities repeated one central warning: the greatest danger was rising water, not only wind gusts. By this point, many residents faced a hard choice: attempt a late departure or shelter in place in a reinforced structure above projected flood levels. At 3:05 p.m. Eastern Time, Ian made landfall near Cayo Costa as a Category 4 hurricane. Sustained winds were about 150 miles per hour, or roughly 241 kilometers per hour. Around 3:35 p.m., the center made a second landfall on Florida's mainland near Punta Gorda. This was the peak destruction phase for southwest Florida. Coastal neighborhoods were hit simultaneously by storm surge, wave action, and hurricane-force winds. Water pushed into homes, destroying ground floors, damaging infrastructure, and quickly cutting off road access in parts of the region. From late afternoon through late night on September 28th, impacts escalated almost continuously. In some coastal areas, water levels reached catastrophic heights, while rain bands triggered additional flooding inland. Florida's grid lost stability. By nightfall, outages exceeded 1.7 million customers, later peaking above 2.5 million. Communication, transportation access, and critical services were disrupted. For emergency responders, this became the maximum load phase, when some locations could only be reached after wind and water began to recede. Overnight and into the morning of September 29th, search and rescue operations became the top priority. The US Coast Guard, state units, local fire departments, and police teams operated on water and in hard-to-reach neighborhoods. People were evacuated from rooftops, flooded homes, and buildings with no safe exit. In the first hours after impact, the task load was so high that teams prioritized calls with immediate threat to life. For many families, this phase was decisive. Time was measured in minutes, not hours. By about 5 a.m. on September 29th, Ian weakened to a tropical storm while crossing the peninsula. Later that day, the system moved into the Atlantic, but the danger did not end. Heavy rain, flooding, and localized severe hazards persisted in outer bands. In affected counties, initial damage assessments began immediately. Residential areas, road segments, bridge approaches, and shoreline infrastructure had been heavily impacted. Some island communities were temporarily isolated, and aid logistics depended on temporary routes and marine access. At 2:05 p.m. on September 30th, Ian made a second U.S. landfall, this time near Georgetown, South Carolina, as a Category 1 hurricane. Its intensity was lower than in Florida, but still sufficient to cause renewed flooding, coastal damage, and power outages. Ian confirmed the scale of the event. Impacts extended across multiple states and continued for several days. For emergency services, this meant sustained operations, recovery in Florida at the same time as active response in the Carolinas. By October 1st, Ian had transitioned into a post-tropical system. But the disaster itself was far from over. For weeks, authorities continued to verify deaths, structural losses, and humanitarian needs. Based on combined official reporting and confirmed assessments, fatalities in the US and Cuba exceeded 150. According to NOAA, estimated economic damage was about $112.9 billion, placing Ian among the costliest weather disasters in US history.